Hello, Brubs. We're back with another puzzle.
Welcome to this introductory lecture on great authors of the Western literary tradition. My name's Elizabeth
We're back with a new
Pause
here for a second. New puzzle, since the other one's just too hard for me. Since I'm colorblind. See, this one, although the colors are rather rudimentary and I am colorblind, I can tell what they are. This is a 550 piece puzzle, and without further ado, let's go on with it. I'm gonna turn on a little background noise. So
this first lecture, I have two main objectives.
Pick some of these up today at the thrift store. Great authors of the Western literary tradition. So we can listen to this while I'm puzzling, drinking pumpkin spice.
The ancient world. So my first objective is to talk about the overall shape of the course, what we're setting out to do here. I'll begin by defining the terms Western and literary, or literature, as we're using them in this course.
As loud as that goes. So, all right, let's go. A few of these pieces are like permanently stuck together, so I did not disengage them. Also, this puzzle is not going to fit on this board, so I am going to put it on a little sideways here. This puzzle should be way easier. All right, let's see what we got here. Open the chat room.
And I'll consider at the end of the lecture some of the difficulties inherent in studying.
See if these will come apart. Nope, see, these are stuck together as well. So it's not cheating. I guess it's kind of cheating, but I can't help it.
Created by one author, creating out of his own or her own literary genius. So to start out with, for the overall parameters of the course, what do we mean by the Western literary tradition? Western, as we're using it here, could be defined to mean the literature of European and European-derived.
Should sort all these while I'm doing it, but
I say European-derived, obviously, to cover cultures like, well, our own, American, Australian, Canadian, South American, all of those cultures draw on earlier European.
Four corners. Where's the second corner?
But using the term European to describe Western literature in early stages poses many questions itself. Because, first of all, as I've already said, I'm starting with Mesopotamian and Hebrew literature. That's not European.
Apparently, this puzzle was manufactured by Dayton Hudson Corporation, so probably dates to the 80s.
Both of whom were actually African. We consider them members of the Western
it's got a name, Boundary Waters Herd of Reindeer, size 18 by 20 fold. Really should put the yellows by themselves as well.
To say that the Western literary tradition is a tradition whose main sources of inspiration, whose main foundational texts are the Bible on the one hand, the Hebrew Bible,
the
and
Bible,
the New Testament, and ancient
Ish-kabibble
literature on the other hand. So those cultures that derive their main sources of information from those two sources, the Bible and
blue, we'll keep in there.
That's what we mean by the Western tradition. What about literature?
What is that, pink?
That's probably
or red?
More difficult to define.
One of the two.
The basic sense of the term is something written, something in letters. That's what literature means. But as I already
something in letters.
Passing, and as we'll see in the next several lectures in particular, many of the works we're going to consider were composed originally without the aid of writing. So if we define literature as works that were created in writing, then we have to leave out, the Homeric epics, the Epic of Gilgamesh, a good part of the Bible. So that doesn't really work either. Now, we could get around this issue by saying that for the purposes of this course, at least, literature consists of works preserved in writing, whether they were originally composed orally or in writing. We have them now in writing.
It's my child's old DVD player. Good old times. I had to dig it out of the basement.
A subset of written materials. If we turn to the Oxford English Dictionary, we'll find, among other meanings, definition 3A.
It's a little sliver of green, bruv.
Is, quote, the body of writings produced in a particular country or period or in the world in general. I think most of us would say that's too broad a definition to be terribly helpful. If literature includes the body of writings produced in a culture, then the phone book, the Sears catalog, and the advertisements that come in your daily newspaper would have to be considered literature. And I think
it is.
Draw the line somewhere
I would not.
lower than that.
I disagree with you, ma'am. Old newspapers were more literature than literature is now.
Would be to say that it means narrative, i.e. the use of language to tell a story. And that will
Look at that deer.
Many of the genres, both in poetry and in prose. For instance, epic, history, drama, even short lyric poems, all can be said to tell a story in some sense or another. Novels, certainly, in the later part of the course.
Certainly.
But there are other.
She kind of sounds like Elaine from Seinfeld.
Parts 4 and 5 on medieval and Renaissance literature that aren't narrative in the sense of telling a story. Rather, they're philosophical, meditative, or exploratory texts. And yet most of us would certainly still include works by such authors as Descartes, Rousseau, Voltaire as literature.
I thought it was Descartes.
So perhaps the most useful approach is to define literature not so much through its form, written and or narrative, but through its effect.
I like how she says written.
Back to the Oxford English Dictionary, we find a continuation of the definition that I think is more helpful. Quote, literature is now also used in a more restricted sense, applied to writing which has claimed consideration on the ground of beauty of form or emotional effect, close quote. And I think that's probably the key to what most of us understand when we use the term literature, that it's not just writing of any kind, but it's writing that has a claim to consideration, again, on the ground of beauty of form and emotional effect. So that leaves out not only the phone book, it also leaves out the National Enquirer and various other forms of writing that most of us consider literature. So, if those working definitions will do to go on with, I could probably spend a whole course of 24 lectures trying to figure out exactly what's Western and what's literature. But if we can go on with these working definitions, what are we trying to do in this course? In this course, the four other lecturers and I are setting out to offer you a sampling of great literature of the Western tradition. And I really want to underline for you that word sampling. The name of this course is not all the great authors of the Western literary tradition, or even the great authors of the Western literary tradition. It's great authors.
Great authors. What happened to the other puzzle? I'll tell you what happened to it, Bubba. It's too hard. I'll save that for a fucking famine or something. This one's easy. Or at least I think it's going to be easier. I was at the thrift store today and I said, hey, maybe I should look for some puzzles that won't take me 16 weeks to finish. I will get back to it, though.
And that a very great deal is being left out. I will mention throughout these lectures authors that I wish we had time to devote a lecture to, and we don't. Aristotle,
don't want to torture myself too much.
A few of the names that occur to me, and to whom I will refer in lectures on
Is that
other
pink?
authors,
I ask
but we
again.
don't have a lecture on any one of those three. And I'm sure that my colleagues, the other four lecturers, each of them will also refer to authors that they wish they could talk about but don't have time for. A great deal had to be omitted. And as is the case with any survey or smorgasbord type course,
Smorgasbord of literature.
On any of the authors or works that we do discuss. Those of you who are former teaching company customers who have bought teaching company courses before will realize that what we're doing in this course is, in effect, the opposite of what we normally do in a teaching company course. Normally, we go into 12 or 24 lectures worth of depth on one author or a couple of authors. For instance, I did a course on Herodotus, the Greek historian, in which I spent 24 lectures talking about Herodotus, his cultural background, his achievement, and so forth. In this course, Herodotus gets one 30-minute lecture. Clearly, we can't go into depth or into detail on any of what we're covering, and that's why I'm calling this a smorgasbord. We're offering you a sampling. We're scratching the surface and hoping to whet your appetite for more and point you in directions where you can use it.
Hey, we'll just keep making videos.
So the course is divided into 7 main sections, each one focusing on the literature of a particular historical period. We've tried to range fairly widely.
Hey, let's look at Monster.
And in genre to give you a true sampling.
See, a lot of these are stuck together, and I don't want to tear the
literature as well as
tear it, bruv.
That we're looking at. Parts 1 and 2, which I deliver, cover the roots of the Western literary tradition in Mesopotamia with the Epic of Gilgamesh
Mesopotamia
and in the Hebrew scriptures. And then we trace the development of literature in classical Greek and Roman culture. And I'll
you guys see we got a bunch together.
Talk in more detail
break them apart,
about what I'm doing
put them in a pile.
Part 3, which is taught by Professor Thomas Noble, covers literature of the Middle Ages. He'll start with Beowulf, and this section is especially rich in epic. Along with Beowulf, you'll also be studying the Song of Roland, the Song of the Cid, Dante's Divine Comedy, and various other works. In Part 4, Professor Ronald Hertzman looks at the literature of the Renaissance. Here you will meet humanists such as Erasmus and More, essayists such as Montaigne, as well as Cervantes' great novel Don Quixote, and you'll also study the plays of Shakespeare, Marlowe, Lope de Vega, obviously a great deal packed into that one section. In Part 5, Professor Susan Heinzelman will discuss the neoclassical literature of the 17th century, starting with the French playwrights Molière and Racine. She will then turn to the 18th century, often called the Age of Enlightenment or Age of Reason, and will discuss Rousseau, Voltaire, and others. And she'll end that section with looking into the 19th century and Romanticism by discussing Blake and Goethe. And then finally, in parts 6 and 7, Professor James Heffernan will bring you to the modern world by examining the literature of the 19th century and 20th century. Here he will discuss poetry, but this section is especially
the total black.
Novels. Austen, Dickens, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, all of those writers will make an appearance in parts 6 and 7. So that's the overall shape of the course. Very great deal being covered. Also, unfortunately, more than we would like being left out. But as I said, think of it as a smorgasbord and a sampling. That's what we're trying to do.
I'm not going to think of it as a smorgasbord ever.
Detail about parts 1 and 2. In those two sections of the course, we'll discuss the foundations and beginnings of the Western literary tradition. And these sections range very widely within themselves over time and over cultures. The basic organization that I've devised here is chronological. Occasionally, I'll break the chronological frame a bit. For instance, the last two lectures of part 2, lectures 23 and 24, are on the Gospels and St. Augustine. If I were going in purely chronological order, I would have needed to put the Gospels back. But it seemed to make sense to group the two lectures on Christian literature together. But the basic organization is chronological. The first part of the course, dealing with Near Eastern and Mediterranean foundations of the Western tradition, lays the groundwork for our discussion and brings us up to the high point of classical Greek literature in 5th century Athens. We'll begin in Lecture 2 with the earliest known work of literature, the Mesopotamian Epic of Gilgamesh. We'll then turn to the Hebrew Bible, and Lectures 3 through 6 will consider some of the most important texts in that foundational collection of literature. After that, we'll move on to Greek culture, beginning in Lectures 7 and 8 with the epics of Homer. Lecture 7 is on the Iliad, Lecture 8 is on the Odyssey. In Lecture 9, we'll look at Greek lyric poetry, focusing especially on the works of Sappho and of Pindar. And then the last lectures of Part 1, Lectures 10, 11, and 12, bring us to the classical age of Athenian literature by discussing the works of the three great tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. In Part 2, we'll continue our survey of Greek literature in Lectures 13 through 17, and then move on to Roman culture and Roman literature. Lectures 13 and 14 continue our look at 5th century Athenian literature by talking about the two great historians, Herodotus and Thucydides. Lecture 15 takes us back to theater with discussing the comic playwright Aristophanes, who wrote during the end of the 5th and the beginning of the 4th centuries BC. The 4th century was also the time when Greek philosophy came into its own, and particularly with the works of Plato and Aristotle. In lecture 16, and I have to say this is one of the places where I feel the most, well, I won't say unhappiness, but where it was hardest to put what I wanted to say into one 30-minute lecture. We don't talk about Aristotle. Plato gets only 30 minutes. And in that time, we really only look at the Republic, and within the Republic, we focus on Plato's own view of literature. So lecture 16 is on Plato. In lecture 17, we move on to talking about the Hellenistic age, that is the age of Greek culture that followed the high point of Greek classical literature. It was the 5th century. The Hellenistic age begins in the 4th century and runs through the 1st century BC. We'll talk in lecture 17 about the comic playwright Menander, and then about Hellenistic literature in particular, especially touching on the poet Callimachus and his work in the Great Library and Museum of Alexandria. Then in lecture 18, 19, and 20, we turn to Roman poetry. Lecture 18 discusses the Roman lyric poets Catullus and Horace.
Catullus, hell yeah.
19, Virgil and his great epic, the Aeneid. And lecture 20, Ovid. All of these poets, Catullus,
Gotta
Horace,
cover
Virgil, and
Catullus.
Ovid, had enormous, incalculable influence on later Western literature works.
Like E. Cummings.
And so they are crucially important, not just in their own right, but in the influence they had on the later authors you'll be studying. Lectures 21 and 22 will look at Roman prose. In lecture 21, we'll talk about Roman historiography, and lecture 22 we'll look at the development of the ancient novel. Yes, there were ancient novels, as well as modern novels. We'll talk about a couple of them in lecture 22. And finally, as I already mentioned, the last 2 lectures of part 2 will bring together threads from the Hebrew Bible, Greek literature, and Roman culture intertwined in the development of Christianity. Lecture 23 will examine the Gospels, and lecture 24 will discuss...
Just so you know what we're listening to, if you really care. Probably don't. Hey, look, I found the 3rd corner.
On the development of later Christian thought and of Western literature in general. So that's
got our piles going. Puzzle should be way easier than the B puzzle I attempted and quit.
Literature in this course. There are obviously a great many different ways to approach the study and discussion of literature. And each lecturer in the different parts of the course will have a slightly different perspective. The literary critic Carolyn Halebrun, who most people probably know better under her pseudonym Amanda Cross. Under that name, she wrote mystery novels featuring an English professor and detective.
I didn't know she was a historian.
Carolyn Halebrun suggests that there are 2 basic kinds of literature. And actually, I'm taking this quote from one of her mystery novels. So this is actually the character Kate Fansler saying this, but I think Carolyn Halebrun would have accepted it herself. 2 basic kinds of literature, quote, that which still speaks to us and our particular anguishes of today, and that which is a literary audience and can only have a scholarly to us as we try to discover what the work meant to those for whom it was written. Halebrun calls the first of these types of study of literature that still speaks to us. She calls that type of studying literature literary criticism. She calls the second type, where we look at literature to try to see what it tells us about the culture that wrote it, she calls that literary history.
Whoa, don't fall over, buddy. We got a long way to go here. No collapsing job.
As a means of thinking our way into the study of literature, these 2 different ways of looking at a text. We can look at, say, the Iliad for what it says to us today, how it moves us today, what we can find in it for our own lives. That would be literary criticism in Halebrun's definition of the term. Or we can look at the Iliad for what it tells us about the culture in which it was created, the different values, the different worldview that those characters and the implicit first audience had. That would be literary history. And for the purposes of this course, I want to look at the works that we study from both these angles. Almost everything we're reading in this course was chosen because it does, at least to some extent, still speak to us in our anguishes of today. And in fact, when we're dealing with the ancient world, probably most of the works that have survived are still read and are still considered classics because people do still find something directly to connect with in those works. So that would be the literary criticism in Halebrew's definition of the term side of my approach. But my own approach as a literary critic, both in my teaching, in my scholarly work, and in what I want to do in this course for you, my own approach incorporates a good
She's
deal
doing
of
it for you,
what we
buddy.
call literary history. In other words, I tend in the classroom, in my writing, and here, I tend to try to set the works that I'm talking about in their original context, their own cultural and historical context, however much that's possible.
She wasn't trying to make money putting out these
Because I think to have
DVDs. She was helping you.
we really need both of these approaches. If a work doesn't
That's a
speak to us
quality
in any
woman
way
right there.
whatsoever, we're probably not going to bother to read it. We, meaning people who are not professional scholars, are probably not going to bother to read a work with which they can feel no direct personal connection.
Bullshit.
But on the other hand, if we don't understand the assumptions and concerns of the culture that created a particular literary work, we will, I think, miss a great deal of its richness. And so I try to use both of those angles in my own approach to literature, and that's the approach I'll be taking in this course.
Almost done sorting.
Has produced a great many theoretical approaches, and literary theory is a fascinating topic in its own right. In fact, there is
More
a
deer.
company course on literary theory for those of you who are interested. I'm not going to adopt any particular theoretical stance as an overarching framework for this course. I'm not going to talk to you as a feminist literary critic.
No, she's a feminist literary critic.
Or as a structuralist, or a post-structuralist, or a postmodernist, or a Foucauldian, or any of the numerous possible approaches that one could take. Instead, as I said, I will be trying to discuss the works both for what they can say to us as still living works of literature and as historical, or if you will, cultural artifacts, telling you what they seem to tell us about the culture in which they were formed and how those two things work together to help us understand the texts as richly as possible. In particular, the study of ancient literature brings specific problems with it. I've touched on this already in this lecture, but I want to go into some more detail now about some of those problems. When the literature in question was formed in an oral rather than in a written context, this brings with it a special series of problems and of difficulties in discussing the literature. Paradoxically enough, because after all, I am...
Uh-oh. She stopped. What's going on, baby girl? You having a meltdown?
Of the Western literary tradition. Paradoxically enough, for some of the most important early works of Western literature, it's problematic, if not invalid, to speak of an author at all. And we can see this problem with the Epic of Gilgamesh, with the Homeric epics, and even with the Hebrew scriptures. The Epic of Gilgamesh, which I'll talk about in the next lecture, in lecture number 2, developed over a period of some 1,000 years or more. It exists in several different fragmentary versions on cuneiform tablets.
Who do they attribute that to? Roland?
Literally fragmentary.
The Epic of Gilgamesh?
It exists in several different versions on fragmentary cuneiform clay tablets from a period stretching over 1,000 years and in different languages. Can we talk about the Epic of Gilgamesh at all, let alone can we talk about an author? When we have various different versions
I think we can, baby girl.
in different languages, what does it mean to talk about the author of the Gilgamesh epic, or even about the epic itself? Can we safely assume that the latest version, the one that's usually referred to as the standard version, as I'll talk about in the next lecture, dates from the 7th century BC, that's the latest version we have, is it in some sense the most authentic? Now it's tempting to say, well, yes, of course, it's the latest one, therefore it's the best one. But if we think that through, then are Charles and Mary Lamb's tales from Shakespeare written in the 19th century more authentic than the First Folio? Or is Laurence Olivier's greatly cut film version of Hamlet a more true, a better, a more authentic version than the folio versions? The fact that the version is latest.
All right, we got them sorted, Bobs.
Make it best. Another way to go at trying to deal with Gilgamesh, and this is a tactic that's often taken by many modern translators, is to do a compilation, to put together a composite version that preserves the fullest treatment of each
Hell yeah.
individual episode wherever it appears. So one episode from a text written in, say, the 9th century BC, another episode from the 7th century, fill in the gaps wherever you find them. Okay, that gives us a nice complete version, but it represents a work that, as far as we know, never existed in Mesopotamian society. So you see the kind of difficulty that we have as the further back we go, the more crucial this difficulty becomes. What about the Iliad and the Odyssey? They are
No way that can fit, or is that piece just janked up?
As the foundation
I think that fits.
of Greek literature. It's probably not
Or
an
it's a mess.
exaggeration to say that just about everything else ever written in classical
I
Greece,
don't know.
drama,
Just keep it
history,
together.
philosophy, lyric poetry, in some sense draws upon the Iliad and the Odyssey.
Drawers
The
upon
ancient
it.
Greeks themselves attributed these texts to a single author called Homer, and modern scholars still tend to speak of Homer as a kind of convenient shorthand for whatever process by which these epics came to be in the form in which we now have them. That gets awfully cumbersome to say, so we just say Homer. But modern scholarship is virtually unanimous in agreeing that the Iliad and the Odyssey...
I didn't see the other corner, which is very troubling.
...one individual genius named Homer or anything else, but rather are the culmination of a long oral tradition. Now, we're in better shape with them than we are with the Epic of Gilgamesh. We do have a text. There's an agreed-upon version, however it came into being. There's an agreed-upon version that classical Greek authors and classical Roman authors knew and referred to, but still, referring to an author of these texts.
Three corners.
Homer wrote
Where's the
Iliad
fourth?
and Odyssey is, as I
Where
said,
is the fourth
workable
corner?
only as a kind of shorthand. The process
Be
of
really
composition is
angry
actually
if there's no
much
fourth
more
corner.
complicated than that. We'll talk about that a bit in lecture 7.
Don't see it.
These problems are perhaps most severe of all in our approach to the Hebrew Bible.
Could be the one of these
Because,
black
of
ones, though,
course,
couldn't it?
this is a sacred
No, because none of the
text
corners are
from the
black.
religious traditions
That
of
one could
three
be
great religions,
theoretically
Judaism,
black.
Christianity, and Islam. And many
These
of
aren't
the
even corner
adherents of
pieces,
those
you
religions
idiot. This one's a corner
consider
piece, huh?
the Hebrew Bible, and
Alright,
for that
well,
matter,
that
the New Testament
solves that.
Christians, but the Hebrew Bible, many of the adherents of those religions consider the Hebrew Bible the Word of God.
Alright, we got
In other
that
words,
corner
if you
right
ask
there.
a great many adherents of the three
Stop
great
building
religions,
on it,
who's
bruv.
God in the Bible, the answer would be God. And that may be true in a theological sense. I'm not going to debate that here. But when we're talking about the human authorship of the Bible, the person whose hand actually wrote down the texts that we now have, again, scholarship identifies multiple authors for the different books of the Bible. There is not one author who sat down and wrote out the entire Hebrew Bible. In fact, multiple authors writing at different times are discernible even within individual books, such as Genesis. In Lecture 3,
Dude, this puzzle is almost too easy.
How it came into being, the Genesis of Genesis, sorry, I couldn't resist that, and the so-called documentary hypothesis, which traces at least 4 different authorial strands in the book of Genesis itself. So again, the earliest works we're talking about, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Hebrew Bible, the Iliad, and the Odyssey, in this course on great authors of the Western literary tradition, those are works in which our sense of authorship doesn't really apply. And yet they are crucially important foundational works for the Western literary tradition, and that's why we're including
Going to fit there, bruv? Hell yeah, we got all the reindeers in a row. Hell yeah.
That we'll consider as we move on into our discussion of the foundational texts of the Western literary tradition. Betty Davis once said in the movie All About Eve, "Fasten your seatbelts, it's going to be a bumpy ride." I'd like to modify that a bit.
I'd like to modify that a bit.
But it is going to be a fast ride, so I would advise you to fasten your seatbelts. As I was working on putting this course together, I found it absolutely exhilarating, at the same time as exhausting, to work through writing the lectures for 24 lectures on everything about ancient
I mean, this lady's really giving it to you.
I hope that you will find it equally exciting and rewarding to come along for the ride. So,
Look at
as I said, fasten your seatbelts. And in the next
That
lecture,
corner's gonna
we'll
be
begin
there.
our actual study of the Western literary tradition by looking at the Mesopotamian Epic of Gilgamesh.
Where's these up here? Which reindeers? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yeah, it's got to be up there. Hi,
in which we're going
Elizabeth.
to talk about the
How are
Epic
you?
of Gilgamesh. The Epic of Gilgamesh is the earliest surviving work of literature in the literary canon, and yet this work had disappeared, had become entirely unknown by no later than the 2nd century BC, until a version of it was discovered by archaeologists excavating the ruins of the Royal Library of Nineveh in the 19th century. This rediscovery of the Epic of Gilgamesh in the Library of Nineveh is one of the most exhilarating archaeological accomplishments of the 19th century. It was part of the uncovering of ancient Mesopotamian culture in general, and among the other things that archaeologists discovered were fragments of tablets containing versions of the Epic of Gilgamesh. In 1850 and 1853, archaeologists excavating in Nineveh found the Royal Library, which contained collections of Ashurbanipal, the last great Assyrian king of the area, who had ruled from 668 to 627 BC. Ashurbanipal had compiled a library in which he collected a great number of texts on cuneiform tablets, clay tablets, written in the Akkadian language. And among these tablets in the ruins of the library were 12 containing what scholars now call the standard version of the Epic of Gilgamesh. I'll come back to the different versions of this epic a bit later in the lecture. The archaeologists who discovered these tablets weren't able to read them. They had no idea what it was that they had found, but they sent these tablets and many others back to the British Museum in London, because these were British archaeologists. The first publication and translation of any part of the Gilgamesh epic was done by the British Assyriologist George Smith in 1872. In that year, in 1872, Smith presented a paper, a scholarly paper, to the Society of Biblical Archaeology in London, and his paper was on what he called a Chaldean account of the biblical flood.
It's not Chaldean?
Chaldean is another term for Mesopotamian.
I thought it was
This
Chaldean.
was tablet 11 of the Gilgamesh tablets, which does indeed include an account of a great flood, and we'll come back to that and its parallels with the account in Genesis near the end of this lecture. Now, understandably, Smith's publication of this fact caused great excitement, since it seemed to provide independent verification of the biblical account of Noah. If you can imagine being George Smith, reading for the first time in all those centuries another account of the flood story that no one had expected, no one knew it was there, that has got to be one of the most exciting moments in the history of scholarship, when he realized what it was he had in front of him. But neither Smith nor anyone else realized at that point that these fragmentary tablets also contained the oldest work of literature in the Western tradition, the Epic of Gilgamesh. Since Smith's publication of the flood story in 1872, our knowledge of the Epic of Gilgamesh has increased enormously. For one thing, archaeologists have continued to excavate in Mesopotamia, and they've discovered more tablets which fill in some of the gaps in the fragmentary version discovered in the 1850s, although, as I mentioned in the previous lecture, the process of filling in gaps from other tablets is in itself problematic. Archaeological excavations and decipherment of other Babylonian texts have increased our knowledge about Mesopotamian culture in general, and of course that's always helpful for understanding how the epic works. For instance, we know that the historical king Gilgamesh, on whom the epic is based, lived around 2800 BC and was deified, was treated as a god by about 2600. However, while these continuing discoveries have increased our knowledge of Mesopotamian culture and of the context of the Gilgamesh epic, they've also, as I touched on at the end of lecture 1, made the problematic nature of the Gilgamesh text increasingly clear. As the scholar Stephanie Daly, who's done translation of the Gilgamesh epic, puts it, quote, "The more text fragments come to light, the harder it becomes to produce one coherent edition." So the more we find out about this text, the harder it becomes to say what we mean exactly by this text at all. There are two main sources of difficulty for establishing a definitive text. Those are linguistic and chronological. Mesopotamian literature was written in two different and unrelated languages, Sumerian and Akkadian. Fragments of Gilgamesh poems, both of the epic and of other poems about Gilgamesh, exist in both of these languages, in both Sumerian and Akkadian. The situation is complicated, but very briefly, Sumerian had died out as a spoken language by about 2000. Remember, the historical King Gilgamesh ruled around 2800. So by about 2000 BC, Sumerian had died out as a spoken language, but it continued to be used as a priestly and literary language. Think of the way Latin was used as a language of scholarship in Europe long after
I will think about it, ma'am.
were French, Italian, Spanish, and so forth. In fact, scribes, Mesopotamian scribes, had to learn Sumerian before they were trained to write their native Akkadian. If we use the later European comparandum, that's not as strange as it sounds. A little boy going to school in Germany in the Middle Ages, for instance, probably would have learned to read and write Latin before he learned to read and write his own native German. So scribes had to learn Sumerian before they were trained in writing their native Akkadian. Akkadian was the common spoken language for about 2000 on, when Sumerian died out as a spoken language, but there was undoubtedly a period of overlap when Akkadian was becoming ascendant and when spoken Sumerian was dying out. Akkadian became a language of literary production from around 1750 BC on. So there's a stretch of centuries when probably there were oral traditions about Gilgamesh circulating in both Sumerian and Akkadian. And we have some written versions of Gilgamesh stories, the epic and other poems, in both of these languages. Now, our primary versions of the text of the epic of Gilgamesh itself are all in Akkadian. But there are other extant Sumerian poems about Gilgamesh that overlap with some episodes of the epic. As I said, it's an extremely complicated situation, and you can see why Stephanie Dalley says the more we find, the harder it becomes to come up with a text.
Yes.
Even when we look just at the Akkadian versions of the epic, the picture is still extraordinarily complicated. There are fragments of 3 different main versions of the epic of Gilgamesh, which span a period of
It's going to be his legs here.
The so-called Old Babylonian versions were written around 1700 BC. The standard version, which is the one discovered on the 12 tablets of Nineveh, dates from the 7th century. So there you have a 1,000-year gap. Those 12 tablets that were discovered in the Library of Nineveh contain the
So we got legs over here.
version, so-called, on the first 11
I
tablets.
assume these are the legs.
Turns out to be an Akkadian translation of an unrelated Sumerian poem about Gilgamesh, not part of the epic itself. In between the Old Babylonian and the standard version were the middle versions. Sometimes scholarly terms make sense. The middle versions are in between the Old and the Standard. They were written between 1500 and 1300. Copies of these have been found as far afield as Anatolia, Palestine, and Syria, along with translations into the native languages of those places, just to make the situation even more complex. So, studying the epic of Gilgamesh is thus
where them legs
thing from studying most literature.
So those legs got to go up there.
Since there is not a text of the epic, and I talked
those legs
about
go down.
in this lecture how difficult it is even to say what we mean by the epic. And the term standard version is something of a misnomer, but it is the term that scholars tend to use for the text that was found on the 7th century tablets in the ruins of the library at Nineveh.
And we got these little legs here.
Now, the textual history of the Epic of Gilgamesh could take a whole course on its own to unravel, but the good news is that enough of the overall plot and themes are discernible to make it clear that this work does indeed
These got to go up top, don't they?
An epic and be called Western culture's earliest work of literature, even in its fragmentary state. The story focuses on one main character of exceptional
These
status
legs
and
got to
divine
go.
parentage. Gilgamesh is king of a great city,
Maybe not.
modern-day
Maybe those
Warsaw.
legs go there.
He's the son of a goddess, although he's part human himself. Those of you who are familiar with the Iliad and the Odyssey will recognize the theme of a hero with divine parentage and a hero who's powerful and preeminent either through kingship or warriorship or some other aspect. The narrative of the Epic of Gilgamesh
These must go here.
in large part on his relationship to his counterpart and friend Enkidu, who is created both as a rival and as a companion to Gilgamesh. Enkidu seems pretty clearly to represent natural
What is
man,
this?
or man before the advent of civilization, while Gilgamesh, the king of Uruk, seems to be ultra-civilized, civilized man to perhaps too much of an extent. The first encounter of these two characters is a fight, but after they fought with one another, they become fast friends. The plot of the epic also deals with two primary themes, the quest for fame
Is that his tail?
and the quest
Is that what
for
that is?
immortality. And the relationship
That corner
between
must
these
get
two
chopped
things.
off. I see what's
These are
going
the
on
same
now.
overriding concerns that inform the Homeric epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, as we'll talk about in lecture 7 and 8. The desire for fame, for your name to live on after you, and the desire for direct immortality. Like Achilles and Odysseus after him, Gilgamesh has to confront the implications of death, Enkidu's death and his own death, and the question of whether fame, whether knowing that his name will live on after him, provides a sufficient compensation for death. The fragmentary state of the Epic of Gilgamesh means that we can't be quite sure how Gilgamesh answers this question, how he comes to terms with the reality of mortality, the reality of death. But most readers seem to think that at the end of the epic, Gilgamesh does find sufficient immortality, or another way of putting it, sufficient compensation for his own inevitable death in surveying the fame of his city Uruk. The end of the epic, as we have it, he's looking at the walls of Uruk and talking about how glorious they are, and most readers take that as an indication that he has come to terms with his own mortality through knowledge that his city and his name will live on after him. Now, another element that the Epic of Gilgamesh has in common with the Homeric epics and with later Greek and Roman literature as well is its assumption of a polytheistic worldview. In other words, this is a world in which there is not one god, but many gods. We'll be talking about, or at least touching on, the nature of the gods of Greek and Roman literature at several points in later lectures in parts 1 and 2 of the course. At this point, I want to sketch out very briefly some of the implications, both for the Epic of Gilgamesh and, bear them in mind, for later Greek and Roman literature, some of the implications of ancient polytheism. I could call it ancient Mediterranean polytheism. Polytheism as it functions both in Mesopotamian culture and later in classical Greek and Roman culture.
No, that can't be right. How many legs are there? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13.
That's the idea that my students in mythology classes always find it hardest to come to terms with. Gods who aren't
Guess I
creators.
can.
Gods who are not transcendent, are not outside the natural world, but are part and parcel of the natural
Where
world.
are the legs?
First and foremost, these gods, these ancient Mediterranean
The gods they were.
and Greek both, seem to be natural forces or elements of the universe, the sky, the earth, the sea, that sort of thing. So they are as much part of the natural world as we are. In fact, Mesopotamian gods, unlike Greek gods, are not even immortal, surprisingly enough. As we'll see in the next lecture, in lecture number 3, a Mesopotamian god can be killed. We'll talk about the death of the goddess Tiamat in comparison to the Genesis narrative in the next lecture. Greek gods were immortal, of course. That's one of the primary distinctions between gods and humans in Greek and Roman culture. But
the gods they were.
Immortal Greek gods were not transcendent,
go there?
by which I mean, again, they weren't outside the universe. They were part of the universe. In a polytheistic system, such as this one, gods are gendered. They come in male and female.
What?
And they reproduce sexually. And this implies their ability to produce offspring.
How dare they come in male and female?
Anyone who's read any Greek mythology will know that the gods very often produce offspring with human beings. And I mentioned already that Gilgamesh himself has a goddess for his mother. In fact, we're told that Gilgamesh is 2/3 divine and 1/3 human. I know, it doesn't work. He has to be either 1/2 or 1/4, but that's not what it says. It says he's 2/3 divine, 1/3 human. His mother is a goddess. And not only is Gilgamesh himself part divine, but again, like the heroes of Greek mythology, he is courted by a goddess. The goddess Ishtar, the Mesopotamian equivalent of Aphrodite, the goddess of sexual passion, wants to marry Gilgamesh and is furious when he rebuffs her. But despite their sexual unions with human beings, as natural forces or elements of the universe, the Mesopotamian gods and the Greek gods are not particularly fond of human beings, particularly disposed to be merciful towards them, to be just or compassionate or benevolent in any way at all. Sometimes they are, but you certainly can't count on it. Gilgamesh, the Epic of Gilgamesh, does not include a creation story for humans in general, as opposed to Enkidu in particular. We're told about his creation, but humans are just there in the Epic of Gilgamesh. There is, however, another surviving Mesopotamian poem, the Atrahasis, which does recount the creation of human beings. And we're told in that poem that the gods made humans so that they themselves, the gods, could gain relief from work. The minor gods were doing all the work, and they were tired. They didn't want to do the work anymore, and so they created human beings specifically as laborers. In other words, humans were to the gods somewhat in the same relation that slaves are to free people in this culture. So humans were made to be the gods' servants or slaves. Humans were created because they were useful. Greek myth doesn't say that humans were created for the purpose of serving the gods, but it certainly implies very strongly that humans must strive to please the gods, must not anger them, and that the gods are, well, capricious and not, again, necessarily compassionate, merciful, or just. So this is a worldview which we need to bear in mind, both in talking about the Epic of Gilgamesh and later when we come to Greek and Roman culture, a worldview in which the justice, mercy, general overall well-disposedness towards human beings of the gods can by no means be assumed or taken for granted. Sometimes the gods want to treat us well, at other times they don't. And these implications of ancient Mediterranean polytheism are, as I said, worth bearing in mind as we move on throughout the first two parts of this course. Now, the plot of the Epic of Gilgamesh, as it survives, can be summarized fairly quickly, bearing in mind all the implications of the fragmentary nature of the text. There are gaps, there are some episodes that are hard to follow, but the overall narrative outline seems relatively clear in all the versions. The first main section, and here I'll be referring to the tablets of the standard version, the first main section on tablets 1 and 2 concerns the creation of Enkidu and his taming through an encounter with a prostitute, or a harlot, as she's usually translated. Gilgamesh, as the epic opens, the king of Uruk, is overly proud and arrogant and is oppressing his people. His people pray for relief, and this is the time when the gods do decide to be helpful to humans. The gods decide to create Enkidu as a kind of counterpart to Gilgamesh, someone who will be Gilgamesh's equal and Gilgamesh's rival, and through his encounter with Gilgamesh will, in effect, get Gilgamesh to behave in a more reasonable way than he has been doing. Enkidu is created as
All right, I
a
think I'm
wild
gonna mix some.
in a natural and uncivilized
Since I'm having some
state.
trouble here with
He
this.
lives with animals, he eats grass, he's covered with hair, he knows nothing of civilization. And fascinatingly, he is tamed or civilized through an encounter with a prostitute who
Jesus.
introduces him to sexuality. She finds Enkidu, has sex with him for several days and nights on end,
Enkidu.
and this somehow brings Enkidu into civilization. Freudians could have a field day with this, and I'm sure they have. Enkidu also is brought into civilization through learning to eat bread and drink ale. To quote just very briefly from the epic itself, the prostitute brings Enkidu into to meet other people, and we're told, bread they set before him, ale they set before him. How to eat bread Enkidu knew not, how to drink ale he had never been shown. The harlot opened her mouth, saying, eat the bread, Enkidu, essential to life, drink the ale, the lot of the land. Enkidu ate the bread until he was sated. He drank the ale a full 7 goblets. His mood grew free. He started to sing. His heart grew merry. His face lit up. The barber groomed his body so hairy. Anointed with oil, he turned into a man. He put on a garment, became like a warrior. He took up his weapon to do battle with lions. A very, very interesting nexus there of eating bread, drinking ale, and thereby becoming civilized. There's no direct connection that I know of between drinking 7 goblets of ale and having a haircut and anointing your body and putting on clothes for the first time, but that's how it's presented. Through sexuality and through learning to eat human food and drink human drink, Enkidu becomes civilized. When he and Gilgamesh meet, they fight, but after the fight, they become fast friends. And the next main section of the epic, tablets 3 through 7, narrates Gilgamesh's and Enkidu's quest for fame and their deeds of prowess. In tablets 3 through 5, the two friends undertake a dangerous journey to a great cedar forest where they kill the forest's guardian, a monster named Humbaba. Now, unfortunately, the portion of the narrative that relates the actual killing of Humbaba is badly damaged, but enough is left for us to realize that they do kill him. In tablet 6, back in Uruk, the goddess Ishtar is smitten with desire for Gilgamesh, asks him to become her husband. He rebuffs her. He points out that her previous consorts, none of them came to a good end, and that he wants nothing to do with her. And in rage, she sends the bull of heaven against him. But Gilgamesh and Enkidu kill the bull of heaven as well. This segment of the narrative shows them fighting monsters,
Crazy shit.
having encounters with this goddess, acting out deeds of heroic prowess. The third main section of the text, tablets 7 and 8, deals with Enkidu's sickness and death and Gilgamesh's mourning for his lost friend. Tablet 7 opens with Enkidu narrating a dream that he's had about his own death. He has dreamed that the gods are angry
Eyeballs.
for the slaying of Humbaba and the despoiling of the cedar forest, and the gods have decreed that one of the two, Gilgamesh or Enkidu, must die. Enkidu falls ill. He laments his fate. He laments that he was ever civilized. He says it would have been better for him to stay out running with the animals and eating grass. And he laments the shame of dying from illness rather than dying in battle. Again, unfortunately, the actual description of Enkidu's death is missing from the end of Tablet 7, but Tablet 8 describes Gilgamesh's mourning for Enkidu. And then finally, the last section of the epic in the standard version, Tablets 9 through 11, narrates Gilgamesh's travels in search of the secret of immortality. Gilgamesh starts by mourning for Enkidu's death. Then he starts thinking about his own death. He starts realizing that he as well will die, and he goes in quest of immortality. He wants to discover the secret of eternal life. He does not want to die as Enkidu has died. Gilgamesh sets out to find the one and only man who has ever become immortal and learn from him the secret of avoiding death. This is a man named Utanapishti. Gilgamesh's travels in search of Utanapishti take him to the edge of the world, to the far western edge of the world, where he will then have to cross the waters of death, also known, I suppose, as the Atlantic Ocean, if we want to try to map this onto actual Mediterranean geography. At the edge of the world, he meets a goddess, Shiduri, who keeps a tavern. Shiduri tells Gilgamesh that his journey is pointless. She says you will not gain immortality. But she says if he insists on continuing, he'll have to be ferried across the waters of death to where Utanapishti lives on the far side. And
I guess
Shiduri
that's
tells
that eye.
Gilgamesh where to find the ferryman Urshanabi, who can take him over to Utanapishti's land.
That eye.
Gilgamesh finally comes to the land of Utanapishti, and Utanapishti, like Shiduri before him, tells Gilgamesh, your quest is pointless. Death is inevitable. Yes, Utanapishti and his wife are immortal, but they are immortal because they survived the Great Flood. They were the only human beings who survived the Great Flood. As survivors of a flood that had been sent to wipe out humanity, the gods granted Utanapishti and his wife immortality. But that was a one-time only thing. It's not ever going to happen again. It won't be given to any other human being. At his wife's urging, however, Utanapishti gives Gilgamesh a gift for his return journey. He says, I can't make you immortal, I can't tell you how to do that, but I can tell you how to find a plant at the bottom of the sea that will rejuvenate, that will give you back your youth, which I guess is a pretty good consolation prize for not getting immortality. If you could find this plant and then every time you grew old, eat it and become young again, you could at least get yourself an extremely long span of life, even if not true immortality. And interestingly, the name Gilgamesh may well mean the old man has become young again. That may be what the name means. Gilgamesh dives to the bottom of the sea, which is where the plant that Utanapishti has described is. He finds the plant, he picks it, and he sets out for home. However, when Gilgamesh stops for the night to bathe in a pool, he puts the plant down beside the pool, and a snake comes slithering up, steals the plant. So Gilgamesh returns home with neither immortality nor ever renewable youth. This is obviously, among other things, an etiological myth, an explanatory myth for why it is that snakes can shed their skin and apparently become young again. The snake got the plant of rejuvenation. Tablet 11 ends with Gilgamesh talking to Urshanabi. He was the ferryman who took Gilgamesh across the waters of death, remember? Gilgamesh
Remind me never to read Gilgamesh.
to Urshanabi, saying, look,
sounds like some butter churning bullshit,
so
to be honest with you.
Immortality comes to nothing, but he does end up, at least, back at his own city, praising its walls. Now, Gilgamesh's conversation with Utnapishti in Tablet 11 includes the narrative of the Great Flood that so astonished George Smith and the Society of Biblical Archaeology in 1872. And the parallels with the Genesis account of Noah's flood are indeed striking. In both stories, there's a divine decision to send a great flood to wipe out humanity. In both stories, a god warns one man to build a boat and to save not only himself but also animals. There's a detailed description of the building of the boat, and after the flood, the survivor sends out a bird to see if there's anywhere to land, to see if dry land has appeared again. So there are clearly some strong narrative parallels, but there are also some very striking differences. Utnapishti takes other people with him, including all his relatives, as well as craftsmen and artisans, where Noah takes just his wife and sons and their wives. The flood lasts only 7 days, rather than the 40 days and 40 nights of Genesis. And most importantly, Utnapishti and his wife are given immortality since they survived, which certainly does not happen for Noah and his wife or his children. Another important difference is recounted not in the Gilgamesh tablets, but in the Atrahasis, that other Mesopotamian poem I mentioned that talks about the creation of humanity. In Genesis, God decides to wipe humanity out because of their sinfulness. But in the Atrahasis, the gods are annoyed by human overpopulation. Human beings are making too much noise and the gods can't sleep. And that's why they decide to wipe human beings out. So again, the difference, the motivation is very, very important. Now, when these sorts of parallels between the Gilgamesh flood narrative and the Genesis story were first identified in the 19th century, one reason they were so electrifying to scholars, one reason they were so important was because they raised the question of priority. By that I mean they raised the question of which text is influencing which text. Was the Genesis narrative written first, and did the Gilgamesh narrative draw upon it, or the other way around? The Genesis narrative was written no earlier than the 10th or 9th century BC, as we'll talk about in the next lecture. The Mesopotamian material is much older, but this doesn't necessarily settle the question of priority. The written texts of both cultures reflect oral traditions that are much, much older, and so just because the written Mesopotamian version we have predates the written Hebrew version doesn't necessarily mean that the Mesopotamians were the first to tell the story. Perhaps the only thing we can say with certainty is that flood stories and other elements of Mesopotamian and Hebrew literature were current in the ancient Near East, were traded back and forth between cultures. Different cultures wrote them down in somewhat different versions. Trying to establish direction of influence or priority is probably impossible. Well, fragmentary though it is,
all right, we need a corner piece.
Though it may be to piece together one firm version, Gilgamesh, nevertheless, has the power to move and astonish readers even today. Clearly, it is filled with extremely rich possibilities, thematic possibilities for exploration and consideration. One of the most obvious and fascinating to me themes is the connection of sexuality and civilization, or sexuality and self-awareness as a human being. That Enkidu only recognizes that he is human, only becomes human, really, when he comes into sexual self-awareness. Then there's the whole treatment of male friendship. Enkidu and Gilgamesh fight. They try to kill each other, and then they become best and closest friends. Now, one could spend a lot of time talking about male psychology, male bonding, and why it is that trying to kill one another links them together as the closest of friends. Their companionship is expressed thereafter in shared dangers. One could also explore the parallels between Gilgamesh's wanderings in search of immortality and Odysseus's wanderings in which he rejects immortality. I'll come back to that very briefly in the lecture on the Odyssey. The more one looks at this epic, the richer it becomes. And I think that makes it a very fitting beginning to a course such as this one. As far back as we can look, we find that human beings are fundamentally storytelling creatures. Aristotle said that man is an animal that lives in a polis, not a political animal, but a man that lives in a polis, a man that lives in an animal that lives in a city. One can also say that human beings are storytelling animals, are animals that tell stories. One reason we tell stories is both to ask and to explore questions of what it means to be human. And here, as far back as we can look in extant literature, all the way back in the Epic of Gilgamesh, we find the same questions. What separates humans from animals? What is friendship? Why do humans die? Could we avoid death? Where do we find comfort for death, our own and others? Like all the world's greatest literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh doesn't give us any pat, easy answers to these questions. Instead, it helps us see what the questions are. So in this lecture, we've laid the beginnings of the course through looking at the Epic of Gilgamesh. In the next lecture, we'll turn to the Hebrew Bible, talk about Genesis and the documentary hypothesis.
At the end of that tape? No, here we go, lecture 3.
Hello and welcome back to lecture 3. In this lecture, we're going to start our discussion of the Hebrew Bible. I'll begin by outlining the terminology that scholars use to refer to this text. We'll talk a bit about the so-called documentary hypothesis, and then we'll turn to an examination of the opening narratives, the creation narratives in the book of Genesis itself. The Hebrew Bible is, without question, among the most important foundational texts of Western culture in general and of the Western literary tradition. It's very difficult to choose which parts to focus on. The first point I need to address is the terminology that we use in referring to this book, or books might be a more proper way to put it. What we're discussing here in this lecture and the next several lectures is the canon of texts accepted by Judaism as the Bible and by Christianity as the Old Testament. One term often used to refer to these works is Tanakh. That's an acronym for the 3 sections that comprise the canon in the traditional Jewish division. The first section, the Torah, so that gives us a T of Tanakh, consists of the first 5 books of the canon. This is also often called the Pentateuch, from a Greek term meaning 5 scrolls. So Genesis, Exodus, Numbers,
Say 5 squirrels or 5 scrolls?
The next section in Hebrew is called the Nevi'im, or prophets. So that gives us the N of Tanakh. And the final section is the Ketuvim, or writings, i.e. everything not defined as either Torah or prophets, and that's where the K of Tanakh comes in. Now, in this lecture, I can only look very quickly at the Torah's composition and importance, and then we'll focus in on Genesis. I would refer you to the Teaching Company course on the Old Testament by Amy Jo Levine, who covers in far more detail issues that I can only touch on or just have to bypass entirely. In the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, we find many of the most famous and most important stories of the Hebrew Scriptures. This, of course, is where we get the accounts of creation, of the flood, the covenant with Abraham, the story of Moses, his life is leading the people of Israel out of captivity in Egypt, on and on. Many of the stories that have loomed so very large over Western civilization, both in art and in literature, are found in these first 5 books. The only one we can touch on in any detail is the creation story. And I'll use that story as an example through which to address some of the questions about the composition of Genesis in particular, and of the Torah and indeed the Tanakh in general. Now, the first 5 books of the Tanakh are traditionally attributed to Moses, sometimes referred to as the books of Moses, and yet scholars generally agree that these books are the work of more than one author. Among the clearest indications of multiple authorship are the following. The Pentateuch, or the Torah, shows variations in its ways of referring to God. At times the word used is Elohim, and that's normally in English translated as God, with a capital G, of course. At other times, the word used in Torah to indicate the deity is the 4 letters YHWH, often vocalized as Yahweh and usually in traditional English translation translated as the Lord in small capital letters. If you can picture an English text of the Bible in your mind, you'll know that what I mean by the Lord in slightly smaller capital letters. So that's one indication of multiple authorship, these two ways of referring to God, Elohim or Yahweh. There are also variations in vocabulary and style. Now, I have to admit that I myself do not read Hebrew, so I'm having to take other scholars' word for this. But there are apparently variations in vocabulary and style in the writing that indicates writing at different times and by different authors. There are also contrasting perspectives. Sometimes we get different versions of the same story. I'll come back to that in my discussion of Genesis. And sort of the equal and opposite of that, material is duplicated. You'll get the same story told about different characters, the same story told with or without variation in two different places. All of these and many, many other such things are seen as evidence by scholars that the Torah was written by more than one author at more than one time. And the most widely accepted explanation of the compositional process of the Pentateuch is what has come to be called the documentary hypothesis, which doesn't mean documentary in the sense of a film describing something, obviously. It means that scholars have traced at least 4 different primary documents lying behind the Torah as we have it now. According to the documentary hypothesis, these 4 main source documents are what we call
Eyeballs.
J, E, D, and P. And I'll explain each of those. There was a Yahwist narrative
Those
written
big
in the
eyeballs
10th
there.
or 9th century BC. So that would be the earliest strand that we have in the Torah. It's called the J document because the documentary hypothesis was first developed by German scholars, and in the German transliteration of Hebrew, Yahweh begins with a J. So the J document is the Yahwist narrative, 10th or 9th century. There was an Elohist narrative, normally called E, that was composed in the 9th century, a narrative in which God is referred to as Elohim. There was the Deuteronomy, the 5th book of the Torah, was written probably in the 7th century, and that's referred to as D. And finally, a priestly source, or P, dates to the 6th or 5th century. So 4 different documents ranging over about 500 years. And according to the documentary hypothesis, not only were these documents written at different times, but the Torah as we have it was assembled in stages starting in the 8th century, when an editor, or a redactor, as he's sometimes referred to, combined J and E. So first you had the Yahwist narrative, and you had the Elohist narrative. Someone put those together, probably in the 8th century, to give a document that we often call JE. It's a hypothetical document. It doesn't exist anywhere, but that's the reconstructed process of composition. Around 500, a second editor added P, producing the hypothetical document JEP, and Deuteronomy was added to the first 4 books of the Torah around 400 BC. These different stages in the text's development are discernible in the styles, the emphasis, the theological viewpoints of the different editors. And to take what I find the most fascinating example of the different voices detectable in the Torah, I want to consider the creation stories as recounted in Genesis. The Yahwist narrative, that is the earliest strand of the creation story, runs from Genesis chapter 2, verse 4b, through Genesis chapter 3, verse 24. According to this narrative, the Lord, Yahweh, created man in the sense of male human being from the dust before there were plants yet on the earth. And after creating Adam, a word that just means man in Hebrew, the Lord planted a garden and placed the man in it. The Lord then made plants grow, told Adam to till the garden, and gave him instructions about which plants he was allowed to eat. The man was prohibited from eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Genesis chapter 2, verses 16 through 17 says, "And the Lord God commanded the man, you may freely eat of every tree of the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it you shall die." The Lord then decided that the man needed a companion. And first, the Lord made all the animals and brought them to the man, and the man named them, but apparently looked at each one and said, well, that's an elephant, but it's not my appropriate companion. That one over there is a kangaroo, but no, that won't work either. There's a zebra. No, that's not a companion for me. So the man named all the animals. Genesis chapter 2, verse 20 says, the man gave names to all cattle and to the birds of the air and to every animal of the field. But for the man there was not found a helper as his partner. By the way, I'm using the Revised Standard Edition when I read quotations from the Bible in this course. Next, the Lord cast the man into a deep sleep, removed a rib from his body, and created a woman as a companion for the man. And of course, next, the serpent persuaded the woman to eat the fruit of the forbidden tree. She in turn persuaded her husband to eat as well, and this violation of the Lord's prohibition on eating from that tree led to Adam and Eve's expulsion from the original paradise, the Garden of Eden. Now, in many ways, this is the most familiar part of the Genesis creation story, but it's not the earliest part in terms of how we read the story now. It's earliest in terms of composition. But the opening chapters of Genesis, chapters 1, verse 1 through chapters 2, verse 4a, the opening chapters differ both in emphasis and, surprisingly, in details. These opening chapters are the priestly account, the P document, and they focus on and recount the creation of the whole cosmos. At first, of course, there's a formless void, and then God creates light. Genesis 1, 1 through 5 reads, "In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. Then God said, 'Let there be light,' and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night, and there was evening and there was morning the first day." So after separating the primeval waters on the second day by creating the dome of the sky, God then creates the dry land earth and the plants on the third day. Then on the fourth day, he creates the sun and the moon. So the first 4 days of creation in the priestly account, the opening chapters of Genesis, are given over to the creation of the environment in which both animals and humans can live. On the fifth day, God creates swimming and flying creatures. On the sixth day, he creates land animals of all kinds, including humans, both male and female. This is where the King James translation, it says male and female created he them. God gives the humans dominion over the other creatures, and he tells them they may eat every seed-yielding plant and any fruit which contains a seed. Now, there are then 2 separate creation stories preserved in the first 3 chapters of Genesis, and there are some fairly noticeable differences between the 2 versions. Most obviously, the order of events is different. Just to recap, in the earlier Yahwist account, the order is man, plants, animals, woman. In the later priestly account, the order is plants, animals, humans, male and female. 2 different accounts, different in the order and different in the emphasis. Quite apart from the different order of events, there are some other distinctions as well. The Lord of the J narrative, the Yahwist narrative, is strongly anthropomorphic. By that I mean he's treated in a very human-like way. He walks in the garden. He talks directly to Adam and Eve. After Adam and Eve have eaten the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, God goes looking for them and asks Adam, "Where are you?" Asks him, "Who told you you were naked?" He talks directly to Adam and to Eve. God of the P narrative is far less anthropomorphic. He does speak, but he doesn't walk. He doesn't appear in the garden. In the P narrative, as I already noted, male and female humans are created at the same time, and thus there's no etiology, no explanatory story of female submissiveness. There's no idea that woman was taken out of man. They're created at exactly the same time, and the 2 of them together are given dominion over the earth and over the other animals. Also, the P narrative, the priestly narrative, is far more focused on cosmology and the creation of the whole universe than the J narrative is. The J narrative focuses mainly on human beings and their fall from primeval happiness. It tells us nothing about how the universe came into existence, how or why God separated the waters. Any of that is all of that is missing from the J narrative. The J narrative's main focus seems to be to provide etiologies, reasons for the harsh realities of human existence, including the necessity of work for males and the pain of childbearing for females. The P narrative doesn't address those issues at all. So 2 quite different focuses, quite different styles, one might say. Now, a fascinating aspect of the P creation narrative, fascinating to me at least, is its similarity to the creation narratives of other cultures, and most particularly, the only one I can talk about today, the Mesopotamian creation story, as preserved in yet another Mesopotamian poem that I haven't mentioned yet, the Enuma Elish. Those two words, by the way, just mean "when on high." They're the first two words of the poem. They're not actually a title. They're just the first two words of the Mesopotamian poem that we call the Enuma Elish. In the Enuma Elish, the original state of the universe is watery chaos. This watery chaos is composed of two deities, two gods, a male Apsu, who represents fresh water, and a female Tiamat, who represents salt water. So the primeval state of the world is fresh and salt water mingling together. As they mingle together, other gods are born out of them, beginning with two gods, Lamu and Lahamu, who apparently represent silt. So I suppose if you're creating the universe out of the mingling of waters, silt that can then build up into dry land is a reasonable way to do it. The story, it's quite complex, moves through several more generations of gods and culminates in a war among many gods from which the young god Marduk emerges victorious. And the cosmos attains recognizable form when Marduk kills Tiamat and divides her body in two. Remember, as I said in the previous lecture, in lecture number 2, Mesopotamian gods can be killed. And here's the primary example of that. Marduk kills Tiamat, cuts her body in two, makes the sky out of one half of Tiamat's body and the earth out of the other half. Now, though you may not immediately see it, several of these elements are traceable in the P narrative, the priestly narrative of creation that opens the book of Genesis as we have it. First of all, P shows God creating the universe from pre-existing primeval waters. Again, it says, in the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. Now, some scholars think that the Hebrew word tehom, which is traditionally translated the deep, as in darkness covered the face of the deep, tehom, some scholars think, is cognate with Tiamat, that Babylonian goddess of salt water. If that's true, if those words are actually linguistically, etymologically related to one another, then one way of looking at this is to say that God's control over the deep, God's control of Tehom, parallels Marduk's control of Tiamat. Even if the words are not linguistically related, even if Tehom and Tiamat are not, if you trace it far enough back, the same word, God's division of the waters through creating a dome, i.e. the sky, pretty clearly echoes the cleaving of Tiamat's body of water to form earth and sky. In fact, this explains a verse that I always found utterly incomprehensible in Sunday school as a child. Genesis 1, verses 6 through 8. God said, "Let there be a dome in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." So God made the dome and separated the waters that were under the dome from the waters that were above the dome. And it was so. God called the dome sky. I never could figure out what was going on with that. What does it mean, the waters that are below the dome and the waters that are above the dome? Of course, the King James translation, firmament, just made things even more confusing. But this seems to reflect the same basic idea that the primeval substance of the universe is water, and that somehow that water is divided to create first the sky and then later the earth. Now, these are, I think, some fascinating parallels, but there are also very, very important ways in which the P narrative differs from the Enuma Elish. Both narratives, as I've been saying, seem to assume a pre-existing watery void, which is then formed in some way or another into the recognizable universe. But in the Enuma Elish, that void is itself two deities, Apsu and Tiamat, and they bring forth other gods through a kind of sexualized reproduction.
There's that bastard.
In the P narrative, the world only comes into shape through God's direct intervention, not through the material that's there somehow mingling with itself and bringing forth more material, but through God doing something to the material. Now, this is true even if we accept the view of some scholars that the first words of Genesis should not be translated "in the beginning God created heavens and earth," or even "in the beginning when God created," but something more like "when God began to create, the earth was a formless void," which would seem to imply the formless void was already there and God came to work on it. Even if we don't accept that slightly more drastic translation, the P narrative posits that the original state of the universe, however it got there, was watery chaos, and it affirms that it required the creative agency of God to bring the universe out of that state. So very unlike the polytheistic view, where the gods themselves are the universe, they mate with one another and bring the further elements of the universe into existence. That's a primary difference in the two texts. Also, in the Enuma Elish, the progress of the world from chaos into its present shape takes an unspecified length of time and relies on conflict between a plurality of gods. The whole process in the Enuma Elish is extremely violent and conflict-ridden, and finally, when the dust settles, Marduk, a young god, is victorious and becomes the ruler of the rest of the gods. The P narrative, in contrast, stresses over and over again the essential orderliness of the process of creation. The scholar Robert Alter, an Old Testament Hebrew Bible scholar, points out that this orderliness is achieved through a series of balanced opposites. He says, and I'm quoting here, P actually builds his picture of creation by showing how God splits off the realm of earth from the realm of heaven, sets luminaries in the heavens to shine on the earth, creates the birds of the heavens above together with the swarming things of the seas below. Darkness and light, night and day, evening and morning, water and sky, sun and moon, grass and trees, beast of the field and creeping thing of the earth, human male and female. Each moment of creation is conceived as a balancing of opposites or a bifurcation producing difference in some particular category of existence, close quote. So where the Enuma Elish shows conflict, chaos, fighting, and finally one God emerging victorious, the P narrative shows God imposing orderliness in this series of bifurcations, as Robert Alter puts it. Now, it's perhaps not too fanciful to think that the author or authors of P may have written in intentional contrast to the Enuma Elish. I say that because P is normally dated to the period around or right after the Babylonian exile of the Jews. And let me stress that, the Babylonian exile of the Jews. The Jewish people were held in captivity in Babylon from 586 to 538 BC. That's about the time, the end of that is about the time when we think P was written. Now, that's a good 2 generations of human beings who maintained their identity as Jews but grew up in Babylon, were captive in Babylon itself. In this context, a creation story reworking the Babylonian material into a form consonant with Jewish belief would make very good sense as a kind of reaffirmation of Jewish identity. You've heard the Enuma Elish, you've heard the creation story of our Babylonian conquerors, but no, that's not how it worked. It went this way instead. This is how Yahweh, or Elohim, our God, created the world. If this is correct, then the P story about the creation of humans can also be read in contrast to the Mesopotamian version of the creation of humans in the Atrahasis, that Mesopotamian creation of humans story that I mentioned in the last lecture. The Enuma Elish talks about the creation of the universe. Atrahasis talks about the creation of humans. And you'll remember in the Atrahasis, humans were created to work for the gods, to take over the labor of the universe from the gods. In Genesis, in the P version, well, for that matter, in the J version as well, but particularly in the P version, humans are presented as the culmination of creation, and they're created, I think it's quite implicit in the text, as a good thing in and of themselves. They're not created to work for God. They're not created to perform some sort of function that God doesn't want to perform himself. They're created in and of their own right. So that's an very quick run-through, very quick indication in Genesis of how the documentary hypothesis works, why scholars think that this text was written in several different versions at several different times, and also, I hope, of how understanding that can shed some interpretive light on what we do with the text itself. But the documentary hypothesis covers not only Genesis, but the rest of the Torah as well. Scholars have traced these 4 different source documents throughout the first 5 books of the Bible. And sometimes, for instance, in the flood narrative, they're connected in much more complex ways than they are in the creation stories of Genesis. In Genesis, we have first pretty clearly P and only P. Then we have pretty clearly J and only J. They aren't interleaved with one another. In the flood narrative, however, the narratives of P and probably J are interwoven with one another to form one coherent story, but traces remain of 2 different original versions. For instance, the source narratives differ about the number of animals to be taken on the ark. Just to give one example, the P narrative requires only 1 pair of each animal, but the J narrative distinguishes between clean and unclean animals and requires 7 pairs of each clean animal. And so you get that contradiction. Did Noah take just 1 pair of each animal on the ark with him, or did he take 7 pairs of clean animals on the ark with him? The text says both, and that seems to represent an interleaving of 2 different original versions. Now, in recent years, the documentary hypothesis itself has come in for criticism and revision, and not all scholars still accept it. I do want to clarify what I mean by that. The scholars who don't accept it are not saying, no, there was one and only one author. They're saying there were far more than these 4 source documents. It's more complicated than that. It's a more complex history than that. But the complexity of the narrative tradition out of which the Torah grew, whether we accept the documentary hypothesis or not, the complexity of the narrative tradition out of which the Torah as we have it developed seems undeniable. However the Torah took shape, it contains, as I've already said, some of the most important and resonant stories of the Western literary tradition, as well as, of course, the foundational stories of both Judaism and Christianity. This is particularly true of Genesis. Genesis not only recounts the creation story, but it also includes, perhaps most importantly, the stories of Abraham. And it's with Abraham, of course, that the Lord becomes a God specifically of the Hebrew people, rather than the God of everyone. If we think about the creation stories, as I've just described it, by implication, God the Creator would be the God of all human beings on the earth, right? If he creates the world and creates all human beings, then he would be the God of everybody. It's in the stories of Abraham that we get the idea of a covenant, the first emphasis on the idea of a chosen people, of God separating out Abraham and his descendants to be in a special relationship with God, to be people of the covenant, to be in some sense God's chosen people. And we'll talk more about the covenant aspect of God's relationship with the Jewish people in the next lecture when I talk about Deuteronomy and the Deuteronomy mystic history. After Genesis, the next 4 books of the Torah, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, focus for the most part on Moses as hero, leader, and lawgiver. Tradition dates Moses to the 13th century BC, and so while these books are called the 5 books of Moses, are traditionally ascribed to his authorship, if the documentary hypothesis is in any form at all correct, then Moses cannot have been the author of the Torah, though of course it's always possible that the Torah as we have it, particularly the earliest, the Yahwist narratives, might preserve some of Moses' own writings or own words. But he lived in the 13th century, which is a good 300 years before the earliest written parts of the Torah, at least what we think are the earliest written parts of the Torah. His story, of course, contains a great many notable points. His importance is marked by the narrative of his heroic birth and childhood, the attempt for him to be killed when he was an infant, thwarted by his mother concealing him by putting him in the basket on the river, his rescue by Pharaoh's daughter, his growing up without knowing who he is and then reclaiming his heritage. All of those things mark him out as extremely important, as central in the text. He's also marked out by receiving theophanies, that is, direct visions of God. God appears to him, of course, in the burning bush. God speaks to Moses when he gives Moses the 10 Commandments. So Moses has a direct, conversational, one could almost say, relationship with God, which marks him out as extremely important. Interestingly, and this applies to many of the other patriarchs in the Torah as well, Moses is at first unwilling to accept the task required of him. When God first picks him out, Moses says, "You don't really want me, couldn't you take my brother instead?" But he is, nevertheless, eventually he does accept the task that's put upon him. And he is, of course, the recipient and spokesman of the 10 Commandments. He's also the leader of the Israelites in their flight from Egypt, the person who leads the Jewish people out of captivity in Egypt. Perhaps the most haunting detail of Moses' story is that he leads his people within sight of the promised land, but he cannot reach it himself. He can only look over and see the promised land. He can't get there himself. Now, this strong narrative focus on Moses in the Torah probably led to the assumption that Moses himself had written the Torah. Although there were always problems with that assumption. For instance, his death is narrated, and how could Moses himself write the story narrating his own death? But as I've said, modern scholarship assumes that Moses could not possibly have been the author of the Torah, but his figure looms so large that if we think of the words, the books of Moses, if we think of Moses not meaning authorship, but meaning the books about Moses, then I think we can still fairly refer to the Torah as the 5 books of Moses. So in this lecture, we've started looking at the Hebrew Bible by talking about the terminology, the documentary hypothesis, and looking in some detail at the creation stories in Genesis. In our next lecture, we'll continue our discussion of Torah by looking at Deuteronomy and the so-called Deuteronomistic.
Sounds great. All right, let's pause that there, and we'll stop this here. Okay.